Hi, everyone. Welcome to this new interview in Doing Sociology. Today, we have with us Professor Radhika Chopra. She was a professor in sociology at the Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi, before she retired in August 2020. Her areas of interest are militancy movements, transnational migration, memory and memorials, gender and masculinities, Punjab studies, and visual cultures. Some of her books include Amritsar, 1984, A City Remembers, published by Lexington Books in 2018, Militant and Migrant, The Politics and Social History of Punjab, published by Routledge in 2011, and Reframing Masculinities, Narrating the Supportive Practices of Men, Orient, Longman, 2007. We welcome you, ma'am, and we're very excited to have you here.
Thank you very much, Rituparna. It's nice to see both of you here.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. So, if our viewers or audience would actually remember, we had a series called Learning in COVID, and it was mostly about showing what we did in COVID-19 times through visuals. So Professor Chopra is actually going to use a lot of visuals in this session to talk us through the idea of memories and memorials particularly. So we would begin by asking you this question that, what role do memorials play in keeping the past alive? Particularly, we have also seen how the Jallianwala Bagh issue is in the limelight right now. And we would like to know this relationship, keeping in mind your own work in the context of Punjab.
Okay, thank you, Rituparna. So if we could just see the first slide for a moment. This is Jallianwala Bagh before the memorial was built, but after the event of 1990. This is almost immediately following the event of 1919, which happened on the 13th of April 1919. It is, you might ask that, what is this day that is being remembered, 13th April 1990. And 13th April 1990 in the North Indian calendar, but particularly for Punjabis, I think, it's the day of Baisakhi, and it's one of the few solar calendars, solar rituals, or solar-oriented rituals marked by the sun rather than the moon. So the date never changes. So in that sense, the calendar is fixed, rather like the built memorial. But for the moment, let me go back to this particular image. This image is just of an open field, and it looks quite dug up, and it looks quite, what should I say, an open space, a bit ordinary. But you can also see that something is happening here. So this is a photograph that was taken at a time when the memorial was being conceived, the memorial that we know of today. Rituparna, if you could just go to the second slide for a moment, and we'll come back to it. Yeah, so this is the memorial, Jallianwala Bagh, as we see it today. This is that stone flame, that the flame of remembrance, the idea that, the flame is the light of remembrance that is now being encapsulated. Let me go back to the first image of that open, dug up space, let me say. And this is when the memorial was being conceived. You can imagine that post-1990, 1919, when the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh took place, it was a massacre which I'm sure everybody knows about. I mean, everybody knows that General Dyer came through a narrow opening into this bagh, into this open space where people had gathered, seemingly to celebrate Baisakhi, a very momentous moment in the ritual calendar of Punjab. But of course, it wasn't just a celebration. It wasn't just a ritual moment which is cosmologically informed. It was also a political gathering. And the reason which is the reason why General Dyer was there, to quell that politics, to quell that political unrest. very, very quickly, let me just say that, there's a prehistory to 13th of April, and that prehistory is about a set of colonial acts under the Rowlatt Act in particular, which sought to suppress the media, to suppress information, which sought to suppress protest, which sought to suppress any kind of agitation being mounted against the colonial state. And in particular, the Rowlatt Act, which sought to suppress information. And two people were arrested for protesting this particular act, and they were arrested and then transported to Dharamshala, Kichlu and Satyapal Dang. Now, so the gathering, in fact, at Jallianwala Bagh was in part in protest against these arrests. So from the British point of view, from the colonial state's point of view, this was not just about rituals. This was also a political effort of gathering a set of people to mount a kind of more organized movement against the colonial state. There's even a further prehistory to that, and I'm not going into it. All I'm trying to suggest is that clearly the moment at which General Dyer entered is not an ad hoc moment. It's responsive to something that happened. An event comes from other events. It unfolds. And therefore, when you look at this dug up site, you can see that, for people who were clearly relatives or people who tried to then take this massacre at Jallianwala Bagh into another movement. Some people argue that Jallianwala Bagh and the massacre and the protests around Jallianwala Bagh that followed the massacre were the first beginnings of the nationalist movement. It's when Gandhi started becoming more vocal, more heard, more important on a sort of anti-colonial nationalist movement stage. So Jallianwala Bagh has a lot going on in there. This dug up field has a lot going on here, because you can just imagine that if it was so momentous, both in terms of its prehistory as well as its post-history, its immediate aftermath, what it stood for, what people tried to make of it, the meanings that they gave to that protest gathering, let's say, to the massacre that happened, to the protesters who gathered, to the protesters/devotees who gathered there. What Jallianwala Bagh should look like, what this memorial should be, would be a arena itself open to a great deal of discussion. So while in the present, memorials present this very accomplished memory, all done and dusted, in fact, you can see in their prehistory, there was a lot of discussion around it. And that discussion, oddly enough, the very fact that it's opened up now again, tells us that memorials have this double face to them, that there's a sense in which memory is frozen, but the remembrance of the past is the process that continues to unfold. And from now on, I'm just going to use the idea of memorial along with the idea of remembrance, because it seems to me the word remembrance does two things. It harks back to something that should be remembered, that is part of a memorial site, a geographic space. At the same time, remembrance is a process. It's something that harks towards, or that suggests and orients itself to an active process of trying to remember something, of making sure that you remember something. If that's the case, then remembrance itself, and therefore memory, isn't such an accomplished event after all. Memory is much less fixed, because then again, two other things come forward. Who decides what's to be remembered? Who authorizes that this and this alone is legitimate memory, and this is what you should remember about it? And who contests that authority over memory? The second part, that if somebody actually dominates the shape of memory or tries to control memory, they are people in power, which means that there's a whole slew of others who are disempowered, who are not part of creating that memory, who are on the edges of memory. And their memories are somehow less significant, or more, I would imagine, they are people whose memories are not so comfortable, that somehow contest the very authority of those who say that this is memory and try and legitimize and fix and shape it. So there are so memorials are very interesting in the sense that on the one hand, they present this space, and very often memorials are in fact state-funded places. They are places where the state has entered to give money to architecture a place or shape it, even give permissions for its usage and so on. And in fact, in Amritsar, where Jaliyah Bagh Memorial is, the street where it is, that very place, the Bagh, was one of the very few open places in that very dense city. And so people actually used that Bagh all the time and still continue to use it. Right up to 2016, 2017, when the Bagh again was reconstructed and remade into a new memorial, part of a thing that I will talk about a little later, a sort of heritage that needs to be remembered, also authorized by the state in control, the Punjab state in control of the government in 2016. So look at it, 1919, the colonial government, 1919, the nascent nationalist movement, the movement into the usages and shaping of Jallianwala Bagh, where that dug up site, actually this Bagh was finally, this memorial was erected almost 2 years later. So the immediate aftermath. And then the sort of usage of that Bagh over a long, long period of time. People would go there, they'd lie around, they'd take a lunch break, they'd take a picnic, they'd go and see the flame, but then they might lie on the grass, have a, nice snack, which they have taken in and so on. And how this part of sort of the Bagh becoming a leisure space, an open space, a garden space in the middle of a dense city became problematic for the state, because it didn't seem to capture the heritage of what Jallianwala Bagh stood for, that is the valorous history of Sikhism and the protest against states. And this, of course, is tied up with the very next image that we have, which I'd like to show you. This is now I'm taking a leap forward into another moment of time and into another space, which is the Darbar Sahib in Amritsar, what we know as the Golden Temple, sort of more colloquially as the Golden Temple. And next to it is a memorial in Shantivan, which is the memorial site of the the cremation ground, where Indira Gandhi was cremated after her assassination in October 1984. So from 1919 and 1920, I mistakenly called the Bagh 1918 and Memorial 1918. I correct myself. The memorial was finally erected and finished in 1921. So I'm jumping forward into 1984, many, many years later again. And the space that I'm going to talk about, a bit like the Bagh, which is all disemboweled and dug up in its initial moment, you have on the left not quite monument, but emblem of memory. It's almost like a broken up space with holes in it. And you wonder, well, I mean, what's this then? Because in contrast to the Jaliyah Bagh, which is perfectly shaped, perfectly accomplished, this particular shaped chhatri is all full of holes, and it's all sort of looking a bit decrepit. So what's so important about it? And why is it still here? And in fact, today, while Jaliyah Bagh in 2021 is being contested because the state government stepped in again to try and beautify it, to make it more attractive to tourists, to make it more part of a sort of visited tourist site and put it on the map, the tourist map and the visitors map of Amritsar. People, of course, protested saying, we don't want a beautiful site. This isn't about beauty, it's about violence. Why were they talking about Jallianwala Bagh in those terms today? It's precisely because of this oddly pockmarked chhatri that we see in this image. Because this chhatri was part of another massacre or another battle. And this is the battle of Operation Bluestar that happened literally half a mile away, less than half a mile actually away from the site of Jallianwala Bagh. It happened in the precincts of the Golden Temple complex, the Darbar Sahib, when the Indian army, rather like the General Dyer's colonial army, entered this sacred place, the Darbar Sahib, a site that a monument, not a monument, a shrine that is one of the most important shrines for Sikhs. And of course, the reason they entered the shrine is because they felt that, their argument was that people who were protesting against the Indian state had taken refuge and sanctuary in that site and were arguing for a counter state. So again, Jallianwala Bagh as the moment at which another state is emerging, the nationalist Indian state in 1990, the Jallianwala Bagh was exactly the moment at which the nationalist state, the new nation state, contested the right of the colonial state to rule over them. Similarly, in 1984 and its prehistory, the movement of Khalistan contested the right of the Indian state to rule and decide the affairs of Sikhs. I won't just say Punjab, but Sikhs. And they argued for a new state of Khalistan, an ethno-nationalist state. And the Indian state, of course, wasn't having any. There was a lot of violence that preceded 1984, but in June 1984, also a ritual moment, also a cosmologically important ritual commemorative moment in the calendar of the Darbar Sahib. It was the anniversary, the death anniversary of one of the 10 gurus. So lots of people, there was a whole congregation of devotees. There were whole lot of people who had gathered within the Darbar Sahib. And it's at that moment that the environs around the Darbar Sahib, the Golden Temple complex, were barricaded. A curfew was declared on the city of Amritsar, again very reminiscent of 1919 Amritsar, when curfew was declared by the colonial state. There was a sort of shutdown, and people were trapped, let's say, within this place, the Darbar Sahib, within the shrine. And the army went in. And we know of that army operation as Operation Bluestar. Again, a bit like Jaliyah Malabar, it's become part of our, I mean, just about everybody's heard of it. Yeah, everybody knows about Operation Bluestar. They may not know the details, but they know, yeah, that happened. What it is exactly, it's almost irrelevant to people. They know it as part of their political history of independent India. Yeah. Now, of course, what does this pockmarked Chhatri suggest? Why is it retained in this fashion, if you will, within a shrine where other photographs of the shrine are actually of a very beautiful, peaceful, serene place? The reason of to retain it in this form is because it suggests the battle and the fact that that whole shrine was literally wounded or devastated by the army action. And the Chhatri is that memento, if you will, or the memory that retains the signs of battle. What you see are the holes that were driven through by tank shells that were fired, because tanks entered the Darshini Deori, one of the entranceways into the Darbar Sahib complex, and fired in order to try and get the militants out of there, people whom they were calling militants. And of course, for those who were fighting against the Indian state or supported the Khalistani state, they thought of them as freedom fighters. So there was a contest of terms there. The protester, as opposed to the traitor and the militant. Yeah, so there is the idea that militancy again has two legs. One in the state term that describes the militants as terrorists, the other that describes militants as freedom fighters. But the fact of militancy as a violent movement is certainly there. And this Chhatri retains the signs of that violence, of battle. When we contrast 1984, the pockmarked Chhatri, with what is on the right of it, it's a very peaceful looking place, another bagh, the Shanti one. The name is interesting, Shanti, serene, peaceful, quiet. Yeah, it's got trees around it. Again, it suggests this very quiet place. And what you have in the middle is a shila, is rock, which has actually been brought from another part of India to suggest that, you know, this is India here, the whole of it. And this is the natural topography and natural resource of India, because this is where the mother of the nation, if you will, Indira Gandhi, is cremated. This is not the site of her assassination, mind you. That's another site, which is the residence at which in Safdarjung Lane, in Safdarjung Road, where the assassination happened by her two Sikh bodyguards. And the reason for that assassination, again, we know from so many different kinds of accounts, is because of Operation Bluestar. So these two monuments are linked. One that commemorates a desecration of a shrine by the Indian state's military army action. The other, which commemorates a slain leader, a slain mother of India, who nevertheless was the person who ordered operation, or under whose leadership Operation Bluestar happened. So these two memorials, oddly enough, are in conversation with each other. They are spatially, geographically distinct. They are in two separate cities, Amritsar and Delhi. They suggest two different events and two different dates, 6th of June and 31st of October, but of the same year. And it's that same linking in people's imagination that one was a redressal of the other, one was a reason for the other, that connects these monuments one with the other. But they can't look the same because they're trying to suggest something different. Here, in the left-hand left-hand image of the pockmarked Chhatri, it seems to suggest a monument with a memorial where memory has no closure, where remembrance is not fixed, it cannot be forgotten, where an event cannot be forgotten. Whereas in the right-hand memorial, at Shantivan, it suggests a reconciliation of things being laid to rest in peace, Shanti. So it's dialogues at many different levels that are happening in these two memorials. And the left-hand memorial I find very interesting, because what it is doing is telling us that all past remembrances are not peaceful. There's something uneasy about remembrance as well, that it's not always easy to forget the past. And it should not be forgotten. If we could quickly go to the next slide. Again, so this is again back into the Darbar Sahib, inside the Darbar Sahib. It's a new set of things that came up post 1984, and I very quickly suggest what they are. They're all part of evoking the past, evoking the memory of that 1984 massacre, the desecration of the shrine, but they are also not precisely the same. The one on the extreme left is a very sort of plain wall where people, it's actually an exit corridor. On the walls of that corridor, there's a series of names that are inscribed. And these are the names, including the village and the father's name, the way that people in Punjab sort of record who they are and who, where they belong. These are a series of names with village and father's names of people whose bodies were found in the debris of the destroyed Darbar Sahib after 1984. Quite a long time after 1984, actually. 6th of June, 1984, when Operation Bluestar happened. The two images that you see immediately on the right of the wall, the memorial wall, one is an image of a museum, which again was constructed. There was always a museum. There was always a museum in the Darbar Sahib, the Central Sikh Museum, and its holdings, its exhibits were about the religious history of Sikhism. So it had painted portraits of the gurus. It had portraits, if you will, of particular major battles and historical events and so on. But this room that you see right here is a room devoted to 1984 and its particular memorial events, as it were. to make them into a memorial. So it's a very modern memorial, actually. It actually comes up in 2006. It's a long time before this memorial was, in fact, allowed to be built. Though the paintings obviously began a little before that, because immediately after 1984 and right up to 2005, the Indian state actually refused to allow any commemorative rituals, any commemorations and remembrances of 1984, 6th of June, because of the troublesome memory that 6th of June 84 evoked, and the assassination of Indira Gandhi evoked. Immediately to the right of that room that you see, which has the room has 2 or 3 things in it. One is portraits of some of the key leaders of of the Khalistan movement. Not all of them died on the 6th of June 1984. At this moment of time, when this particular photograph was taken of this museum space, a key leader, the reason cited by the Indian state to enter the Darbar Sahib, the portrait of that leader wasn't there. That leader was Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. People know him just as Bhindranwale, his full name, Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. Very interesting that in this memorial space, a portrait of remembrance of everybody else, either who was part of the leadership of the Khalistan movement, who was subsequently assassinated or died, and so on. Those people's portraits are there. Bhindranwale's is not. That missing portrait says a lot. That missing portrait of such a key person in the Khalistan protest ethno-nationalist movement, the missing portrait seems to suggest that even for those who constructed this memorial space, this new room in the Sikh museum, Bhindranwale's memory was an uneasy one. The remembrance of Bhindranwale and what he stood for, or the legacy of Bhindranwale, wasn't easy at all, because the forms of militancy he was suggesting, the forms of protest he was suggesting, was not just against the Indian state. It seemed to militate against what many Sikhs felt was not quite right. So that missing portrait, which actually a portrait does come up eventually in 2011, and it's installed with great ceremony. However, all this time, from 1984 to 2011, Bhindranwale was a missing person in the portrait galleries of the memorial spaces of the Darbar Sahib. And why was that? Because for many people, what they wanted to remember, the key thing they wanted to remember, the key thing where they wanted to fix remembrance and memory, was the desecration and the bombing and the wounding, if you will, of a key building in the Darbar Sahib complex, the photograph of a portrait of which you see on the extreme right, which is the Akal Takht. The Akal Takht is a very premium building, and it's within the Darbar Sahib Golden Temple complex. It is the place where the Gurus established their counter-state against the Mughals, and they held darbars, and they held, gathered their military forces in the forecourt of the Akal Takht. And it's the destruction of the dome of the Akal Takht that became so important in people's memories. But of course, the Akal Takht could not be left shattered. The shattered dome could not be left as a memory. So in its stead, as a kind of substitute, if we could just go back one frame, you have the Chhatri. you have the dome of the Chhatri, which is at the same level, mind you. In terms of architectured spaces, it's at the same eye level above the shrine itself, right on its roof line, is this Chhatri. And then, of course, you have the repaired dome. So when you see the Darbar Sahib and the Akal Takht today, it presents that peaceful appearance of a shrine. It's complete. It has no memory, if you will, in its architecture of the past, of its wounding. Two spaces where that wound, architecture wound, is remembered is the Chhatri on the one hand and the portrait in the museum of the other. So when we go back to this museum portrait of the Akal Takht, this is the place where the Akal Takht as a wounded monument is shown. And this is where the commemorations happen for that past wound. This is where visitors, when they come, they stand before that memorial. But interestingly, this portrait is a portrait that is a key memory for many Sikhs. And it's the memory that they want to retain. It seems to suggest everything. The missing portrait of the slain Bhindranwale, of the Bhindranwale who was actually killed in the army operation, the missing portrait is in a way very much there in people's ideas. When they stand before the Akal Takht portrait, they think about Bhindranwale, but it cannot be shown because for many people who stand before that portrait, Bhindranwale's legacy is still troublesome. And they do want to forget. They do want to lay that some parts of that past, some parts of that memory to rest. So the interesting thing about remembrance is that it is both about evoking the past, but it's also about laying some part of that past to rest, forgetting it. There's a permission to forget, if you will. And the missing portrait was perhaps a way in which the permission to forget some parts of Operation Bluestar and the events of Operation Bluestar was suggested. Of course, that forgetting was incomplete, and eventually the portrait does come out. Let me go to the final slide. Of course, all this is happening in Amritsar, Jaliyah Bagh and Operation Bluestar. All the memorials, so many of the memories are directed towards what happened in 1984, 6th of June, and its aftermath. But of course, 1984 is remembered for another very big event, not just the assassination of Indira Gandhi, but the riots that followed the assassination of Indira. And the congregations in Delhi, the Sikh population of Delhi, felt that they had literally been left out of the memorializations that were taking place in Amritsar. That while Operation Bluestar was being forefronted in memory and remembrance, the riots were being forgotten. So when you look at this genocide memorial, this is in Rakabganj, another Gurdwara, which is in Delhi. It's a very interesting Gurdwara in many sorts of ways, but it's a memorial that particularly commemorates the riots of 1984 because it wants to forefront that massacre, that wound, and that memory. And interestingly, the reason for the choice of Rakabganj is not because any major massacre took place in Rakabganj or in and around Rakabganj. It couldn't have, because Rakabganj literally is within half a mile of Parliament House. So it was in that sense a protected space. No particular huge event happened in Rakabganj, but precisely because it faces Parliament, this genocide memorial is raising questions to the Indian state to answer for 1984. So you can see that memory is constantly unfolding, and this memorial actually comes up well into this century, well into the 21st century. The picture I have here is well before the memorial was actually even established. This is just to mark its inauguration, that a memorial will come up here. So it's a kind of unfolding terrain. Memory is that kind of terrain where memorials seem to suggest a closure. Remembrance goes on as commemoration, unfolding with new things, new questions, new feelings of disaffection and contest. And there are many layers.
Right. Before I pose the next question to you, I must say it was absolutely enthralling listening to that particular answer because it was so nuanced. Yeah, so moving on to the next question, Professor Chopra, you have been interested in doing visual analysis. And in one of your papers, you look at the role of the post-mortem photographs in Darbar Sahib. So could you tell us a little bit about how these photos impact the Muh Dekhna ritual?
In most Indic rituals, when a person dies, if they are not buried, they are cremated, right? Cremation, in a sense, accomplishes the disappearance of the corpse. Yeah? Because in cremation, after cremation, the corpse no longer exists. It's not a physical body anymore. Okay. But before you get to the cremation, at the ceremonies and rituals that precede the cremation, there's a very important moment that happens, which is called Muh Dekhna, or the seeing the face of the corpse. Muh Dekhna, literally seeing the face. And relatives gather around the corpse before it is ritually taken off to the cremation site to see the face of the corpse. So before the corpse's face is covered, in fact, it remains uncovered for a long period of time. And people go up to the corpse and look at it lovingly. In fact, mothers of sons who have died early deaths or unnatural deaths are encouraged to come and see the face of the son. Wives are encouraged to come and see the face of the husband, and so children of their parents, and so on and so forth. Muh Dikhai becomes a very important moment in the ritual process, if you will, as a moment in commemoration, because this seeing of the face is what people will remember of the person even when the corpse is no more there. Even when the corpse as a physical object, if you will, no longer exists. Nevertheless, do corpses become, how are the dead remembered? Well, there are so many different rituals around the remembrances of the dead, portraiture, ritual days on which there's commemorations of remembrance happen, and so on and so forth. But those are of normal deaths. Yeah, those Muh Dikhais and remembrances happen in a particular trajectory of those who die in the normal course of time. Yeah. However, we know our political history is literally riddled with corpses of people who died in very difficult and violent circumstances. How do we remember them? What is that form of memory? What is the form not just of memory, but of Muh Dekhna that happens? And what is the role then there of another memorial form or another memorial object, the photograph? The photograph harks to the past, it harks to somebody or some person who isn't there, but who you can see in the present while you're viewing it. So the relationship that the photograph has is with as an object, it evokes a person, but it also evokes the viewer seeing the photograph, and the whole act of seeing as an evocation of a past or a person in the photograph. So the photograph, in a way, establishes a relationship between what is viewed and the viewer who is viewing. So viewing in that sense is very active. In that sense, rather like commemorations, which are very active, evocative, taking something which isn't there into the present, but remembering it, replacing it in the past, but with your own ideas, if you will, of the present. So very much like commemoration, viewing has that quality. And therefore, if that is the role of, if that is what photographs do, if photographs are active objects in evoking memory of person, then what does the photograph of a corpse do? Why is it that the corpse is photographed at all? When in fact, cremation suggests and burial suggests that the corpse disappears. The corpse isn't there to be remembered. The photograph, on the other hand, is doing something else. It's making you remember the corpse, a muh dekhna, not of person alone, but of corpse, of the person as corpse. Yeah. So the person in death, at the moment of death. So let me just go to the first photograph. This is an archived photograph, and its provenance is unknown. We don't really know where this photograph has been taken, but what we do know about it, where it was recovered from, as it were, is it is a street with bodies, unidentified bodies, of people post partition violence. So in the course of the violence of partition, there were many streets where corpses were just found and then had to be cleaned away or taken away and, dealt with. But these were people who were unidentified. So what you see here is an odd kind of gathering. There's a corpse in the foreground. There are three corpses in the foreground, a little fuzzy, because this is an old photograph. The people at the background are not mourners, people who are connected with them, but the people who are very critical at this moment of the corpse, in the sense that they're going to take the corpse away. And to the extreme left, there's a very small image, in a sense, of a wheel. It's almost a half wheel. I don't know if you can see it. To the extreme corner of that photograph, thanks Rituparna, if you can see a wheel, it's actually of a cart into which these corpses are going to be placed to be taken away and buried or cremated in an en masse grave. Yeah? So we know nothing about who these people are. What we do know is the importance of this photograph lies in the very fact that it is about a very momentous moment in our political history, the emergence of our nation state of India, the moment of partition, which actually emerged out of violence. And this was in the aftermath of partition violence. So here you have a street literally littered with unidentified corpses which need to be dealt with. But not all corpses which were part of partition were dealt with like this. The other corpse whose muh dekhna we have before us is that of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Yeah? And Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi's photograph that you see on the left-hand side is the photograph post his assassination. Gandhi's corpse before his cremation, which was of course a huge event in itself, also much photographed. Gandhi's corpse lay literally in state in Birla House, and there was a single spotlight placed on the corpse, in fact, on the face of the corpse. So even so, the suggestion of this photograph is that not only were people who were the kin of Gandhi or those who were close to Gandhi and therefore close to the corpse, not only could they participate in the ritual of Muh Dekhna of the corpse of Gandhi at the moment of his death or immediately following his death, but an entire nation could gather and see the face, a kind of national Muh Dekhna of a new nation that mourned the death of Gandhi and did so through the Muh Dekhna ritual by seeing the photographed corpse. So the photograph became a very active object in evoking not only Gandhi as person and the event of his assassination, but in fact, Gandhi as he stood for the nation itself. So Gandhi's corpse, in a sense, became the symbolic center, and the ritual of Muh Dekhna became a kind of symbolic ritual process of gathering a congregation of citizens participating in the ritual of Muh Dekhna and expressing their allegiance, not just to Gandhi, but to the new nation for which he stood. So the photograph was one of the early photographs of a corpse, because taking the photograph of a corpse is not normal practice in Indic ritual. We don't actually have that many photographs of corpses in the 19th and mid-20th century, right up to the mid-20th century. So it's interesting when you see the photograph of a corpse. Why is there this photograph? What is it doing? What is it accomplishing? It is accomplishing commemoration and the reason to remember, the object of remembrance, the significance of this Muh Dekhna as a ritual form of remembrance and evoking the past and the person, but informing and shaping the present. So it was literally Gandhi's corpse, Gandhi, of course, and the nationalist struggle, but Gandhi's corpse became the center of coalescing and consolidating the nation. It became, if you will, the moment at which the nation reconciled itself to itself as a nation. It became what Yeats has called the Balinese cockfight. It became that portrait in which and through which the nation saw itself and represented itself to itself. It's very evocative. And people who saw that corpse couldn't keep their tears in check. People who saw the photograph of that corpse couldn't keep their tears in check either. So it wasn't just the Muh Dekhna of the corpse itself as a physical event, as a physical object, but the photograph, which then lingered. After all, I've taken this photograph, or recovered this photograph, if you will, in 2015. So this photograph continues in our national memory, in our archives, in our internet searches. This is a very important photograph with which we identify ourselves, if you will. Of course, that event, but also ourselves in the event. In complete contrast, or well, not complete contrast, in juxtaposition with Gandhi's corpse is the corpse of another slain assassinated leader, Indira Gandhi. Yeah, very much connected to 1984, 31st October 1984, which we just spoke about a little earlier. And her corpse was also laid to rest, was also on display at a place not where she was assassinated, which was Safdarjung Road, not at which she was going to be cremated, which was Shantivan, along the banks of the Yamuna, but in the home in which, her father's home, in which she grew up as a young adult, Teen Murti House, we know it as today. But it was the home where Jawaharlal Nehru lived as during the period of his prime ministership. And this is where Indira Gandhi grew up as a young adult, and in fact, was very much part of events in Veer Murti. And this is where her corpse was on display. And it's just not that display, unlike Gandhi's corpse, that display wasn't just a single still photograph. In fact, the corpse was televised by Doordarshan. So other than the people, her relatives and others who gathered around it, her sons, her daughters-in-law, members of her cabinet, and so on and so forth, the political leadership who were allowed to come and pay their last respects and so on, and do muh dekhna of the physical corpse, the entire nation was actually viewing the corpse of Indira Gandhi through television footage. So this literally moving image moved the nation to mourn the assassinated leader. And we know that at the time that this muh dekhna was happening, the riots in Delhi were also happening at the same time, the anti-Sikh riots. So this muh dekhna was very much part of political events and political moments through which the Indian nation was crafting its sense of self. So this muh dekhna is also a kind of a nationalist, symbolic commemoration of the leader assassinated, but also how that leader needs to be revenged. So it's a very emotive corpse. It's a very emotive moment. And most of all, the televised images and the still images became active. They actually evoked people to do things, including riot. So the photograph becomes an extremely important part of commemorations, and which is why photographs are not just innocent objects, if you will. They're not just flat objects. They are active, they are evocative, they are commemorative. They make people do things. In that sense, they have a relationship with the viewers and viewers with the photograph. So if we could just go to the next photograph. This is the photographs of exactly that. I don't know if everybody can see it in its fullness, but it's the photograph of Bhindranwale taken in the period immediately after he died, obviously. But it's an image that was not released into the public domain for a very long period of time, unlike the two national corpses of Gandhi and Indira Gandhi, which were immediately available for people to see. Bhindranwale's photograph of his corpse, the reason why it was, let us say, restricted in its circulation was in part because of what Bhindranwale himself stood for. And then precisely because he stood for this, let us say, anti-national, separatist, militant movement called the terrorists, the Uber terrorists, literally. you can see that the person who would have taken this photograph wouldn't just have been somebody close to him, because this is the time, remember, he would have died during Operation Bluestar. It's the time when the army had moved in and taken control of the shrine. So the Darbar Sahib and its precincts, the entire complex of the Golden Temple was under army control. So this isn't a photograph which is one that is taken by somebody who was close to Bhindranwale or was part of his movement or anything. It's taken by an army photographer, clearly, though unattributed. You can tell by the circumstance, and most of all, in the way the corpse itself is laid out. You can tell that it's been taken by an official of some sort who needs to do things to this corpse so that whatever is troubling about the death can, in a way, be hidden. So there are two things about this corpse which are very important. Clearly, Bhindranwale was killed. So when he was killed, we don't know what his corpse looked like. It may have been all over the place. It may have been, quite bloody and so on. And it was. We know that from subsequent witness accounts from a person who was part of an investigation against Bhindranwale. He was actually called in to identify the corpse, because before something can be done officially to declare him dead, the identity of the corpse needs to be officially recorded. So the army called in an investigative officer to come and identify who is this, and he said, yes, this is Bhindranwale indeed, because I met him on numerous occasions when I was investigating an event that he was part of, which was, a troublesome event. And when you look at this corpse, there are two things about it that are quite interesting. One, that it's laid out very peacefully. It's still. There are no signs of wounding and battle and blood that are part of this corpse. It's not covered. So Indira Gandhi's corpse was also bloodied. After all, she'd also been shot. Gandhi's corpse was also bloodied. He'd also been shot. But we see no signs of that. And we see instead both Gandhi and Indira Gandhi's corpses very well covered in these white sheets that suggest no hint of a bloody death. Bhindranwale's corpse has a similar suggestion. No blood, very still, laid out almost peacefully. But we know from the witness account that actually he'd been shot in the stomach, in his abdomen. So there was a gaping wound there. And interestingly, his wound is covered by the cloth of his turban. He, on the other hand, this image is not, it's not got a turban on it. Rituparna, did you not get the whole image? Because I can't see the head in what I have.
Just a second, ma'am, I'll try.
Yeah. Just try and sort of, forget. Okay.
No,
okay. Somehow, right. So somehow the complete image maybe didn't come. But let me just tell you about it. The interesting thing about this corpse, the other important, significant thing about this corpse is not only that it's laid very still and its wounds in a way are hidden, but it doesn't have a turban. Now, given that he is a Sikh, the fact of being without a turban and the fact that his hair is a bit open and the top knot is a bit open, shows the fact of a sense of the control over the corpse. The fact that this corpse was not in the hands of people who were kin, but those who had the power over the corpse itself, those who were perhaps the army and the photographers. However, I've taken this photograph, and this is the interesting thing about the way that photographs and images travel and commemorations move. I have taken this image not from the way it appears in an army archive, but the way in which that army archive was displaced and put into an album, which is part of the Sikh museum and library existing in the Golden Temple complex. And the caption below this corpse, the image of this corpse, I beg your pardon, the caption below this image calls him Shaheed or martyr. Shaheed's Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, it says. Shaheed Ji Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale. So it's, though the corpse is clearly photographed by somebody at a moment in which it was in the power of the army, its recovery as a photograph and the caption in particular restore to this photograph and the corpse a sign of respect and the way that the viewer must see this corpse as a shaheed or a martyr. So it's a muh dekhna, if you will, split over two moments of time. The moment of time when the army photographer took this photograph and the person who came to identify the photograph, and then arranged the corpse to be able to have this photograph taken. The second is a muh dikhai or a muh dekhna at a time when this photograph is in place or put into place in a commemorative photographic album, which tries to commemorate and remember Operation Bluestar as a moment in which martyrs like Gandhi emerged. So this is, in fact, part of the martyrology kind of legacy that is being accorded. And this muh dekhna event of the viewer actually seeing this photograph with different eyes of ritual respect makes this corpse a very different kind of photographed corpse altogether. It becomes part of another legacy, if you will, another way in which Operation Bluestar is to be remembered, not as a moment of a takeover and a quelling of a rebellious movement, but a way in which that movement, in fact, stood for something, an ethno-nationalist nation. If we could very quickly move to the next set of images. Okay, however, you know, the viewing of corpses is very interesting because these corpses keep appearing again and again, rather like the corpses of the first photograph of the unidentified dead post-partition violence. We have the memory of other corpses, also not famous corpses. They are not Mohanchand Gandhi, they are not Indira Gandhi, they are not Bhindranwale. They are just ordinary people who died during the course of militancy. So the photograph on the extreme left is the magazine cover of a new magazine called Sikh Shaheed. And it shows the photographs of militants who were clearly killed by the army, but now are being shown, and whose turbans are not there, but who are there with all their wounds on display. You can actually see some of these corpses as quite bloodied, with their eyes half open, or their mouths a little agape, showing teeth and so on. They're not peaceful corpses at all. And the reason to place them there on the magazine cover is to suggest the violence of their death, is to remember those deaths as being effected or having happened through violence inflicted on these persons through powerful states and guns and so on and so forth. So these people are classified as shaheed But unlike Bhindranwale's corpse, where the wounds are covered, here the wounds are on display. And there's a purposiveness to that display in the photograph. It is to remember that violent past or the violence done to the community. So the photograph is evocative in a way as an interrogation of the state, of the Indian state, against the violence done to the community. Similarly, the photograph next to it is a poster, is an image of the face of a corpse, also bloodied, placed on the steps of India House, which is the Indian High Commission in London. And this placing of the poster has happened in 2006 when I took this photograph at a commemorative rally, which literally refuses to forget. It's called the Never Forget processions or the Never Forget rallies. And these rallies actually try and remember 1984 again and again to interrogate the Indian nation state as having wrested the rights of Sikhs, as having decimated the rights of Sikhs or wounded the rights and citizenship rights of Sikhs and treated them as, able to be killed in this quite brutal manner. So the image of, the Muh Dekhna at India House, the poster at India House is not just a Muh Dekhna to evoke the memory of the person by the kin or those who are gathered, but to interrogate the representative of the Indian nation state at the High Commission. And it's an enforced Muh Dekhna, if you will, by the community who gathers, by the migrant diasporic Sikhs, forcing, if you will, the ambassador and all the functionaries at India House to see the face of the corpse. And very interestingly, the diasporic images move on and on. What I have at the extreme right-hand corner is a painted image, is a painting of the moment of the assassination of Indira Gandhi at Safdarjung, but it's done by a Sikh artist, a diaspora Sikh artist. It actually hangs in a Gurdwara in Italy, where there is a fairly substantial Sikh population. And it shows Indira Gandhi being killed, but the caption again is important. The caption is a 2 lines of poetry, and the poetry is in the style of a remembrance kind of poetry, which remembers valorous pasts of Sikh history. And the style of that poetry, or the caption here, is asking Indira Gandhi, well, did you think that the Akal Takht would remain wounded without any retribution? That's the sum or substance of this poetic 2 lines that you have below this. So you can see that Muh Dekhna is not just a private, kin-based familial ceremony, but when it is dislocated out of that family circumstance and into a political context, into a larger public context, it does so through a different form, not the corpse, but the photograph of the corpse. And the photograph of the corpse, therefore, becomes an extremely important style of remembrance, a style of retaining memory, and actually being able to evoke a ritual of commemoration in a particular direction, orienting it in a particular way.
Right. So our next question to you is, on your recent paper on Amritsar, which looks at the newly opened Heritage Street. So how does this particular street help us understand the urban and its relationship to religion?
Yeah. So one of the things about Heritage Street is that work on Heritage Street started in 2015, and within 1 year of its beginning, it was completed and inaugurated by the person who was the chief minister at that time of the Punjab state, himself a Sikh, Sukhbir Singh Badal. And he dedicated the Heritage Street to all the Sikhs who must remember the valorous parts of the valorous past of Sikhism and the glories of Sikhism. Now, the street within the urban plan is very interesting because the street is not a very long one. This remaking of the Heritage Street is quite short. It begins in a way from just a little before Jaliyah and ends at the doorway, literally the threshold of the Darbar Sahib. So very short street, nothing very long about Heritage Street despite its name. But it's much celebrated, especially in, again, the new tourist maps of Amritsar. And it is a sort of place where more and more people are encouraged to go and be part of that, go and shop there and do things there. Though, of course, shopkeepers have a slightly different take on the making of this heritage. I call it making heritage for a very particular reason. If we could just go to the first slide. When I began doing my fieldwork in Amritsar in 2005, the spaces around the Darbar Sahib and the Jaliyahwala Bagh and this whole area, which had been so afflicted by the 6th of June violence, 1984 violence, the Operation Bluestar violence, it was a very crowded, busy place. It was full of bazaars which were selling all these important things, dupattas, pulkaris, turbans, portraits, guru images, souvenirs, this, that, and the other. There were lots of things happening in the bazaar. And so the what we know now as Heritage Street was literally hemmed in by shops and bazaars, by little bazaar shops, all of them selling this very colorful but slightly chaotic mess of a bazaar, as all bazaars are. Clearly, for within these bazaar spaces, there were spots that people still remembered as places where people had died or were killed, or, so there were these little, what I would call grassroots memorials put up in these small shops at little corners of streets or on a wall, a little memorial plaque, a marble plaque, etc., set inside, which remembered 1984, but in their own very individualistic ways. However, for the Punjab state, and remember that by 2014, I think, the Akali government already had a political alliance with the BJP government at the center, and there was a kind of joint governance. I won't go into that part of things. Let's leave it aside just as a footnote. But just to say that by the time 2014, 2015 comes around and the plans for Heritage Street begin to be contemplated and discussed and passed by the municipality and the funding raised for it, a long time has passed between 1984 and 2014. And amongst many segments of the Sikh population and residents of Amritsar, 1984 began to be a memory that they would want to lay to rest. But then, who was in charge of memory and who was going to shape what the memorial of that 1984 looked like? because clearly the way that memory was retained within the museum of the Darbar Sahib wasn't open enough, and it was rather constricted around the controversies of the portrait of Bhindranwale, the wounded dome of the Akal Takht, and so on and so forth. So something else obviously was, there was something else afoot that tried to combat the still militancy that had not died away, but which needed to be controlled. And oddly enough, it was in the urban landscape, exactly at the site of Operation Bluestar and the environs of Operation Bluestar, that Heritage Street emerges. Of course, it wasn't an easy emergence at all. And very much like Bhindranwale, if we could just go to the next slide, very much like the Jaliyah Bagh memorial, when it's coming up, it was all dug up first and things planned and so on and so forth. The bazaar spaces in and around that the Darbar Sahib had to be cleared away. The streets, those narrow little gullies, had to be broadened and reshaped. And so what you have before you are two photographs taken in 2015 of the making of Heritage Street that actually required a whole lot of digging, a whole lot of relaying of pipes, sewage, repaving, urban reconstruction, and urban redevelopment for a kind of beautification of that area, because it was meant to be a very important area around a very significant Sikh site or shrine, the Darbar Sahib itself. The environs of the Darbar Sahib couldn't be left in a mess. So another mess literally was created in the making of Heritage Street. Eventually, what came up through all this digging was to my sociologist eyes, very evocative of the remaking of Paris by Baron Haussmann, who, in remaking and beautifying Paris, literally displaced a great part of the city and its inhabitants and its close quarters and bazaar quarters to another part of the city altogether, and instead drove these wide avenues through the center of the city to open it up to light and air. If we look at the next image, the one following this, if you look at the three images here, you'll see that immediately there's a sense in which the shops have been pushed back and realigned in very straight rows. You can see the making of them. They've been pushed back behind these bamboo struts on the extreme left-hand side. And by the time it says your eye travels to the right-hand image, the extreme right-hand image, the shops have been aligned in a kind of neat corridor with proper, neat signage, all looking the same, no sort of extrusions and protrusions and so on, a very orderly space. The point of that orderly space was the image in the center. It needed to become a kind of, take your eyes straight to the domes of the Darbar Sahib, which you see in the skyline. The street is like a grid, if you will. It's like a point of view. It's like a direction of your gaze to the white marble domes of the Darbar Sahib, the key shrine. And all of this Heritage Street was in order to showcase the Darbar Sahib as a key part of the urban landscape of Amritsar, because by this time, a whole movement had begun to identify Amritsar as a religious center in line with Hardwar on the one hand and Vatican on the other. So it was to make Amritsar not a trading center, but literally to transform Amritsar into a shrine center or a religious pilgrimage center. And the center or focus of that pilgrimage, you can see literally pinpointed in the line of sight that the heritage street suggests, the marble domes of the Darbar Sahib. Go to the next slide, if you would, just for a moment. The left-hand side and the right-hand side, both are two photographs taken in 2017 by me. And they're taken with deliberate intent because though the things in the foreground suggest a very neat and orderly facade, that is exactly what Heritage Street, a lot of it is composed of, facades, which are literally these thin, veiled, architectured walls that disguise the rest of the city, the messy part of the city that you saw in your first slide of those, things being sold in all their color and mess and confusion. They lie behind Heritage Street, behind these facades, behind these veiling walls, literally. And the reason to exclude them was that this was not the heritage that Amritsar should know, but something else altogether. And yet at the same time, the entire city couldn't be destroyed. It would be too reminiscent of 1984, when a lot of the city was destroyed and dismantled. So Heritage Street literally had to be remade and remapped along a very tightly controlled zone. The urban space controlled in terms of, the colors used. You can see this very pale white, pink, and red set of colors. They run throughout Heritage Street. And the image on the right-hand side is particularly interesting because it's literally a thin wall, which has been, it's an existing wall which has been painted over, rather as though suggesting Jaffries and, these, like a miniature painting almost, with windows and balconies and so on. But these are all fake. Huh? This is entirely fake because there's nothing behind it. It's just this flat wall. And it's clearly a disguised wall, a veil that tries to exclude what should not be known and should not be seen and should not be remembered as part of the heritage of Amritsar. The heritage of Amritsar is to be pinpointed. If we could go to the next, no, before we go to the next one, sorry, just go back to the Wailing Walls one. Yeah, so this is the heritage. I'm glad you went just between the two. The heritage of Amritsar lies in the divine shrine of the Darbar Sahib. This is what you must see. This is what needs to be remembered. This is the pilgrimage site. This is the route to the place, the node, the center of Amritsar. This is the navel of Amritsar. This is what this remaking of Heritage Street was trying to suggest. But having suggested this center or this navel, it wasn't going to remain as such, because clearly the residents of Amritsar were not going to participate in a singular heritage. They were part of multifarious heritages, multifarious belief systems, multifarious orientations to not just different gods, but different forms of Sikhism, the different kinds of ways of remembering who is divine and who is not. And here what you're seeing before you are photographs I've taken in 2017, literally within months of the inauguration of Heritage Street in October 2016. This is February 2017. And this is a procession of Sant Ravidas. Now, Sant Ravidas himself is a very interesting person because 40 verses, he was a poet, but he was of the Chamar or the leather worker community. And he was based in Varanasi, but also 40 verses that he has written are part of the Granth Sahib, or the scripture of Sikhism, which is a very important scripture around which the Sikh community consolidates and coalesces and orients itself to. And yet, for the Chamars, for the community of Ravidasyas who believe in Ravidasya, this heritage street was a very exclusionary space, because what it was trying to suggest was a particular formation and consolidation of Sikhism, which did not include them, and literally put Ravidas and his 40 verses into a kind of eclipse, if you will. So the Ravidasya community actually extracted those 40 verses and remade a scripture around which they as a community orient themselves. And it's a different scripture, and they believe in a different guru, but very interestingly, many of their processions and commemorations replicate, almost mime, some of the processions around the guru kirtans and the urban processions that are part of commemorating the Sikh gurus, which take processions, the Nagar Kirtans, which are held on the anniversaries of every Sikh guru, where the kirtan, the procession is taken through the streets of the city, and the scripture with the photograph of a guru is actually carried on in palanquins and in on top of jeeps and trucks and so on. And the entire city, literally, or devotees in the city, proceed along with these guru processions, the Nagar Kirtans. And here, interestingly, what I'm photographing, or what you're seeing, is the commemorative procession commemorating the Guru Ravidas, who stands for and is the symbolic center of the Ravidasya community, who feel excluded from this different heritage as Dalits, as people who are literally on the disenchanted margins of the Sikh community. So this is the procession. We are seeing it emerge literally from the gullies behind those veiled walls, with a jeep emerging from that dark gully and a procession coming out of that narrow gully with Ravidasyas, with the Sant Ravidas, his portrait garlanded on top of the jeep. And in front of the jeep is this procession of people who literally wearing the banner of the insignia, of their faith, which is close to the Sikh insignia, but different from it also. This girl, for example, has it tied on her head, and she's cleaning the street, because behind her will come the portrait of Ravidas. And people are playing the band and so on, the drums, celebrating the emergence of Ravidas. So this was a, if you will, a kind of counter ritual, a counter heritage being suggested through procession to Heritage Street. It was literally, on the one hand, a counter to what Heritage Street and its Sikhism stood for, but also a kind of reclaiming of that space, a reclaiming of that street, that this belongs to us too. This heritage is as we see it. It's an insertion into heritage streets. So, I mean, the Ravidas procession could have been in any part of Amritsar, but is deliberately there in as much noise, with as much fanfare, with as many jeeps and portraits and bands and symbols and garlands and flowers and devotees as it was possible. It's a sort of rich tableau and display of a counter ritual and a demand, if you will, of reclaiming memory, of contesting one heritage and reclaiming memory of another.
Right. Ma'am, so sorry about the PPT. So there was a bug and it suddenly stopped working. So I had to shut it.
No, that's fine. Don't worry about it.
So our last question, since we've been talking about Punjab and of course your ethnographic, very rich ethnographic work, our last question is, since you've been involved in studying the region for quite some time now, what would be your advice to young researchers in terms of approaching the site? What should some of the things be that they should keep in mind?
Yeah, because, okay, let me just start by saying, I think sometimes field sites choose you. You don't choose them. I think Punjab, as a field place, as a field site, must have been walking right behind me all the time that I was thinking of my, when I was doing my MA and when I began my MPhil and so on, when we were studying many different sorts of things. I think the field site of Punjab was probably tapping at my shoulder, in a sense. My supervisor, Professor Andre Bete, a very eminent sociologist whose work we know so well, himself so very much a part of two different kinds of traditions of field sites, one in South India, the other in Bengal, suggested to me that he had a lot of primary material on Bengal, which I could base my research on. And I thought about it seriously. To be honest, I thought, it's like a ready-made field. Here's all the material. It's literally, he pointed to the top of his Godrej covered in his room in D school and said, look at all this material, Radhika, you work on it, And I thought, wow, I mean, this is amazing. I can just plunge into it from day one. But I don't know what pulled me away or pulled me back. I think it was this little knocking on my shoulder, tapping on my shoulder that said to me that, look, this isn't really yours. So one of the things about doing research is that it has to be yours. It has to be something with which you connect, with which you tie in, because the field and its field work and its research will live with you for a really long time. Because I began this research in 1982, 83, and this is 2021, and I'm not finished yet. So it really lives with you. I think one of the things that, the reason it lives along with you, the reason it walks side by side with you, is in part because you realize that there is just so much to discover. It can move from, I began by just looking at things like the village in the usual way of anthropologists, to go to a village study and do village a study there. But I did it because also this little that they have no culture but agriculture. And I wanted to explore the joke. I wanted to see, what does this mean to say that your culture is agriculture? What does agriculture mean in the lives of Punjabi farmers or cultivators or those who work as labor and labor in agriculture? So there's a sense in which right from 1982 onwards, my research began to be a kind of slightly immersive experience, which began with the traditional field work. I did the surveys, household surveys, interviews, and so on. But as I moved along, I also started seeing that the field produces questions and material that you never thought of before. So while I was doing fieldwork, it was just prior to 1984. And I began seeing these reports, newspaper reports. I was learning Gurmukhi. So I was reading Gurmukhi newspapers, and I began seeing in Gurmukhi newspapers reports of these small processions or protest marches against particular state laws and so on and so forth. And I realized that, of course, in learning Gurmukhi, I was also learning about the emergence of a movement. I only recognized this a lot later, but there it was. So I think research is one of those peculiar things where the sources themselves, here it was a language resource, that taught me something else, that was suggesting a particular direction of further research to me. Subsequently, I think as I moved and started writing and became very interested in issues of gender, which has actually emerged from the studies of agriculture and cultures of agriculture. When I began focusing on gender, one of the aspects that constantly came forward to me was how for Sikhs, it was the male body that was a very central part of identity and the formation of gendered identity and religious identity and so on. And so masculinity and gender became part of my explorations. But as I began exploring them, I realized when I'm writing about masculinity and gender as my focus, as my direction of movement, actually the material I'm using is all about Punjab. So much about it is on Punjab, and yet I'm not paying attention to that. Where am I getting it from? And that's when, again, you go back to sources. You begin seeing practices. You begin seeing visual material. You see maps. You see different kinds of newspaper reportage, archives, of course. But there it is. I mean, there's a sense in which I think the field, if you are tied into it in some innate emotional way, I don't know if emotional is the right word for this usage, but certainly in some innate kind of connection, it continuously prods you further. And the masculinity studies then led me to start thinking about the idea of martyrs and masculinity, and led me into religion and Sikhism, led me into the ethno-nationalist movements that were mounted within by Sikhs, and what were they arguing about and so on, what were they asking for. It led me into diaspora Sikh communities, for the book Militant and Migrant, that came, so much of it came out of my research in amongst the diaspora Sikhs in a neighborhood in London, Southall. Yeah. And that really was inflected with the 1984 violence through asylum politics, through the reshaping of religions and never forget rallies and so on. And it's the diaspora remembrances and fieldwork that brought me back to Amritsar as a center, because it seemed to me then in 2005 and 6 and 7, when I was doing my research in the UK and elsewhere, that look, but an event happened, and it began in another city. It began in Amritsar. So what happened there? And when I went there, when I went back to Amritsar, I realized that one of the issues was that of memory. The other issue was that memory kept surfacing through the visual. I kept seeing, I mean, it literally caught my eye. It literally beckoned me from the deepest, darkest corners, interiors of little shops, these little souvenirs that would reach out and beg your attention, catch your eye. The museum and its displays, the exhibits, the politics around portraiture, and everything that we've talked about today. It's how the field unfolds through so many different kinds of aspects. It's centric to Punjab, but I can say that locating myself literally in one space or place has led me in so many different to so many different sources, to painting and portraiture, to photography, to architecture and memorials, to urban plans, to rituals. There's been a whole lot there. As I said, I'm not done yet. Migration, big one for me. So yeah, it's led me in different ways. And I think that's what I would suggest to people now embarking upon research or in the middle of it, that don't ignore the sort of pulls and tugs that fieldwork gives you. Of course, while you're doing it, you are virtually tunnel visioned, and you have to be. You have to produce a written piece of work at the end of it. Yeah, you have to be tunnel visioned. You have to focus. You have to have that. But don't ignore the little tugs that may develop later in interesting different directions.
Thank you, Professor Chopra. I think, that is a great set of advice that you've given, our viewers. I also would personally take a lot from it because, both Rituparna and I, we are just at the, we are very early career researchers right now. So we definitely will take a lot from what you've said. And on that note, we would like to thank you for taking time out and talking to Doing Sociology. And it has been an incredible honor talking to you. And thank you again so much, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Deepali.